Hi, everyone. Welcome to Berkshire Green Drinks. Jane, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, great. Thank you all for joining us, both in person and online. And thank you to the Williams Inn for having us and being so accommodating. And of course, thank you to Mark Brandriss for joining us and taking the time and just coming here to teach us. I usually write down everything I need to remember to say, and I didn't get a chance, so. What? There's a sort of green drinks event next week on Thursday, July 20th. Yeah, and that's happening at Beats Environmental Leadership and Education Center in Pittsfield. Carla Rhodes, a wildlife conservation photographer, is coming to talk about moths. Some of you might remember her from our February Green Drinks this year, and that's starting at 6:30, and the in-person gathering is happening at 5:45. So this event is organized by Berkshire Environmental Action Team, also known as BEAT. I'm Chelsea Simmons, BEAT's Programs Director. If you don't already know about BEAT, you can learn more on our website, beatnews.org, or for those who are here, we have our end of year newsletter over there. Yeah, so upcoming events, I already talked about Carla's. And then 2 days later, on Saturday, July 22nd, we are doing one of our annual river cleanups, the Housatonic River, and that's in collaboration with the Housatonic Valley Association. We need volunteers, so if you'd like to help out, come talk to me or Lucas, or you can email us at team@thebeatnews.org. And then on Saturday, July 29th, there's a mothing demo. It's hands-on. So we will have a couple of light sheet rigs set up and just observing moths and other cool insects. And that's from 8:30 to 11:30 in West Stockbridge. So many of you already know this, but BEAT is a 501c3 nonprofit. So that means all of our funding comes from grants and generous donations. So if you'd like to support BEAT, we have a donation box over there, or we have a donate page on our website. So real quick with Zoom, please stay muted like Jane was saying. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and then during the Q&A, I will relay those to Mark.
And rocks and landscapes isn't overtly environmental in the whole, but I want to emphasize that the landscapes and bedrock geology and superficial geology of the Berkshires are really the base on which everything environmental happens. So I'll also touch on a couple of particular environmental topics as we go through. Okay, so I'll start off with this slide. A vista in the North Berkshires. This is standing on the summit of Spruce Hill at the crest of the Hoosick Range, looking across the valley between Adams and North Adams out of the picture, off to Mount Greylock in the distance. Beyond Mount Greylock is another valley, and beyond that valley, you can see the crest of the Taconic Range at the New York-Massachusetts border. And so I like this picture because it's sort of the extreme expression of our sort of characteristic Berkshires landscape. Mountains, ridges, valleys, and all those things that make it so beautiful. We take a look here at a sort of topographic map, only in this case it's shaded by elevation, shaded relief map of Western Massachusetts. And I'll point out this is from Mass Mapper, and if you don't know about the massmapper.gov website, I encourage you to use it. You can go in there and make whatever sorts of maps you want using all sorts of geographic data, human and natural. But here's Berkshire County. We're sort of the ridge and valley mountainous part, as you know. Then you go through some of the other fell towns down to the Connecticut River Valley here. High elevations are in orange, the lowest elevations in deep green. So if we focus in on the Berkshires, okay, I'm going to go to the northern Berkshires, partly because that's where we are now. That's where the characteristics, the features we're looking at are most dramatically expressed, and also that's what I know the most about, so I can say things without too much fear of being wrong. So, okay, here we are again. Williamstown in the valley here, North Adams and Adams, and that is more or less the course of the Hoosick River flowing through Adams, North Adams, Williamstown, and you go from yellower to greener. So the Hoosick River, unlike most rivers, flows north here. Keep that in mind. The high points, the Taconic Range on the border, the Hoosick Range on the other side of the Broad Valley, and then Mount Greylock and its neighboring peaks right there in the middle, the highest point in Massachusetts, 3,491 feet, I think. There's also Brody Mountain and Jiminy Peak, for those of you skiing. And then the Green Mountains of Vermont, poked down just into the very northernmost part here in Clarksburg and North Adams. Can't remember what comes next. So, right, okay. So that's the landscape features. What are the rocks that we find here? And imagine that we were to just cruise around looking at the basic rock types. There's dozens of rock formations in the Berkshires, but they can really be divided up generally into 4 general groups. And a quick tour of the ones we see here in the northern Berkshires. There's marble, such as we see at Natural Bridge State Park in North Adams. And I want to say, this is a photo by Steve Anderson. I picked it off the All Trails app. I hope Steve Anderson doesn't mind me using it for a nonprofit purpose. So the marble's a calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate rock. And it's a metamorphic rock. All the rocks we're going to be looking at here are metamorphic rocks. Metamorphos meaning they formed as some other kind of rock and then recrystallized at high temperature and pressure somewhere deep within the crust. Before this was a marble, it was a limestone, a sedimentary rock made mainly from the calcium carbonate shells and skeletons of various kinds of organisms. Today that would be things like corals, clams. Back in the day when these rocks formed would have been other creatures, but the same basic idea. Let's move on. Next up, quartzite, the beautiful summit of pine cobble here in Williamstown. Quartzite is a rock made almost entirely of pure quartz, SiO2, very simple chemically. And before it was a metamorphosed quartzite, it was originally a quartz sandstone. Imagine if you took like pure quartz sand like you would see on a beach in Cape Cod, turn it into a rock, quartz sandstone, metamorphose that, and you get something like a quartzite. Okay, schist. Schist is a type of metamorphic rock characterized by the sort of very flaky or slabby way it breaks into fragments, you can see here. This is at the crest of the Hoosick Range, right across from the Western Summit gift shop, recently reopened recently. And you can see that sort of slabby fabric actually has some folds in it, which you can see sort of here. And that's pretty characteristic of schists. This particular schist was originally a fine-grained sedimentary rock, like made of mud and silt. Solidify that and then metamorphose it and you get this schist. We can take a close-up look at this outcrop, and here you can see the folds developed again. And you see these folds at all different scales, from tiny little inch-sized folds to great big kilometer-sized ones as you go through the Berkshires. So keep that in mind. And finally, our 4th major group of rocks would be granite. It's hard to find good outcrops of granite up here in the northern Berkshires because they're covered in soil and moss and lichens and stuff. But so there's some good landscaping boulders all around in Clarksburg State Forest. And so here's Kate the Ranger. And so if you take a close-up look at this boulder, you can see it's a granite. It's originally an igneous rock crystallized deep in the subsurface slowly. So lots of time for crystals to grow large. Here's a penny per scale. Some big feldspar crystals, even an inch or 2 in size, with some dark smoky quartz and other minerals between them. It looks like an igneous rock, but if you look at it closely with, say, a microscope, you'll see that there are new minerals that have grown during recrystallization, partial recrystallization. So instead of just calling it a granite, we should probably call it a metamorphosed granite. So again, all these rocks are metamorphic, and that's a key here. They recrystallize at high temperatures and pressures deep in the Earth's crust. And so that raises the questions, what were the original rocks? Well, I've said what they were generically. How did they form? Where did they form? And why were they metamorphosed? And that's basically the story of the bedrock geology of the Berkshires. And coming up with the answers to these is a project that's occupied hundreds of geologists for the last couple of centuries, and rather than go through the entire history of that, I'll just jump to a quick summary of what we're pretty confident is the answer. And here we are, a little cross-sectional tectonic diagram from Geology of New York, from New York State Museum, but we're right next to New York, so it works for us. So here, some 500 million years ago, 520 million years in this diagram, during the Cambrian period of geologic time. Here is North America, and the Berkshires would have been about here. The Berkshires were on the coast of North America at that time. The rest of Massachusetts hadn't been added yet. And North America was separated by an ocean from a chain of volcanic islands that were slowly, inexorably, by tectonic drift, making their way to the coast of North America. Very ominous. The ocean floor between them was being subducted down into the mantle. We have them converging. And a little more detail in North America, I've color-coded most of the crust of North America at that time was made of billion-year-old rocks, well, billion years old today. These are granites and gneisses, like the one we just saw is the Stamford granite that you see in Stamford, Vermont, and down into Clarksburg. And those billion-year-old rocks are essentially the core of a very ancient mountain belt that has since eroded away and was largely gone, and the deep roots of that mountain range were, by 500 million years ago, exposed on the surface. And so if you've been walking around on the Cambrian North America here, we would have seen granites and so on there. But the granites and so on were continuing to erode down, producing sand and mud and sediment, and that was being carried by rivers out to the sea. The sand was being deposited close to shore. In the little blue bit on the continental shelf. And a little further from shore on the shallow water, limestones would have been forming from the creatures that thrive in the sunlit zone of the sea, sort of like you might imagine in the Great Barrier Reef of Australia now. Creatures making their skeletons and shells and all the dead remains piling up to make a limestone. And also, of course, the rivers are carrying mud and silt, and that gets suspended in the water by waves and so on, drifts out, and eventually settles on the seafloor further out, and from time to time piles up to a degree that it slumps down to the deep ocean floor. My wife's a sedimentologist this year, and if I say anything wrong, let me know. Okay, so those would be deep water muds and silts. And so you can see here we have the progenitors or protoliths for what would eventually become our metamorphic rocks once you bury them, heat them up, and squeeze them. How would you bury them, heat them up, and squeeze them? Well, and here we go. It's probably only a few centimeters per year that this thing is making its way over, but you know, maybe 60 million years later, that's a lot of centimeters. And here we go, crashed into the coast of North America. And imagine that belt of volcanic islands being sort of like a bulldozer, and it picks up and shoves all those ocean sediments back up onto the continent. So the Berkshires are right there in the middle of the action, the coolest place. So you can see, okay, I'm going to say this. You can see here, why metamorphosed? Well, here we go. A bunch of sediments that were deposited at the surface of the earth, turned into stone near the surface of the earth, are suddenly buried as everything is shoved up and stacked into a big pile kilometers deep, and then buried further under lavas and sediments being shed from this volcanic mountain chain. And so everything that was at the surface gets buried deeper, the granites get buried deeper, everything is metamorphosed. Metamorphosed, and you can see also this shoving would also fold and crinkle and disrupt everything. So here's our metamorphic event, some 460 million years ago here. So-called Taconian orogeny, named after the Taconic mountain range. Orogeny being a mountain building event, everything being shoved up into a big heap. Okay, here's just a little bit of a close-up. So now we have, after that collision, we have the billion-year-old crust of granite, now a metamorphosed granite. The limestone and quartz sandstone are metamorphosed to marble, and quartzite is shown in blue, and those deep water muds and silts are metamorphosed to schist. There's our rock types. It's a long, complicated story how we came to that interpretation, but we're pretty confident that this is true, at least in the most general sense. So there's the Berkshires again, right in the middle of it all. And if we look at the bedrock geology of the Berkshires, where are those different rock types distributed? Here's a bedrock geologic map. Again, the magic of Mass Mapper, you can say put the bedrock geology on there. I asked it to put the simplified bedrock geology because we only have so much time. And here's our main rock types. You can see the marbles here in blue. The schists and quartzites are combined together in this particular map in orange. The metamorphosed granites are in red, and then there's also in green some other metamorphosed igneous rocks, which I'll largely ignore here because they're a relatively minor part of the picture, and I don't have any pictures of them anyway.
Is limestone combined with marble in this map?
Yep, so the limestone is now marble, having been metamorphosed due to burial during that whole process. So these are the metamorphic rocks we see today as you travel around. So let's take a look at, again, our elevation map and see how the elevation corresponds to the bedrock geology. By bedrock geology, I mean, you walk around and what do you see? You see trees and plants and mud and dirt and water. If you just scrape all that away and drain all the water until you got to the bedrock underneath, this is that's the map you'd come up with. There'd be marbles here and schists and quartzites there and granites there and so on. So this is a bedrock geologic map. It's obviously we can't see it all down there. We don't want to actually scrape away all the dirt and vegetation and houses. So there's some inference here, but it's pretty well constrained. How does that correspond to the topography? Well, okay, here again we are, the Hoosick Range, Mount Greylock, Taconics, etc. Let's flop the geologic map down on that using the magic of massmapper.gov. Poing, and there we go. And what instantly jumps out at you is the marbles underlie the valleys, including the Hoosick River Valley here from Adams, North Adams, out to Williamstown and up into Vermont and eventually to New York. The schists and quartzites form the high ridges and mountains along with the granites, which are also some of the high elevations. So number one takeaway, pretty much with very few exceptions, the valleys here in the northern Berkshires are underlain by marble and the other rocks form the high areas. That holds true for the Berkshires as a whole. I'll get to that again in the end just to demonstrate. But for now, let's just go around the northern Berkshires here again and see those rocks in the wild. If we drive up to the Petersburg Pass through the Taconics heading to New York, here's the schist in Petersburg Pass, right at the crest, and you lose your next 4 miles. It's high up there, long and steep. Let's jump the valley to the summit of Mount Greylock, schist again on the Mount Greylock summit, again, thanks to Abhinav Ganjaraju. And then cross the valley again from Greylock to the crest of the Hoosick Range. And Adam Lippman gives us a good picture here of schist at the crest of the Hoosick Range. More schist on Greylock in the distance. And what do we see in the valley between them? Marble being quarried at Specialty Minerals, Inc. So here's the town of Adams. Marble being exposed there by quarrying, marble underneath all that green stuff, underneath the houses, underneath the cemetery. And we go down the road to North Adams. We keep driving along there. Here's the current highway in North Adams. Big road cut of marble across from Ocean State Job Lot. Keep going from North Adams to Williamstown. There it is again, marble, newly exposed outcrop during the building of the new Williams College Library. It was left in place there at the insistence of geologists. Okay, so how about if we look at the distribution not on a map, but in a cross section? So let's take a vertical slice through the Berkshires, miles deep, as if we're making a trench and looking at the wall of the trench. And so up and all the way down to 8 kilometers deep. This is what it would look like on a cut through. This is the USGS bedrock geologic map of Massachusetts, which I have here in case anyone wants to look at it afterward, but it comes with a cross section. And here we see it going from west to east. Here's the color scheme has changed. Unfortunately, different maps have different color schemes. The nice thing is the marbles are still blue, so that's easy to see. There's the marbles in various shades of light blue, and you can see the marbles are in the valleys. And the schists, now in purple and pale green, are on the ridges. The schist at the Taconic Range, the schist on the mountains of the Greylock Range. Unfortunately, this doesn't go right through Greylock itself, but it's partner mountains. And the schist at the summit of the Hoosick Range. Now the topography doesn't look terribly impressive here because you know, a couple thousand feet, when you spread it over a few miles, doesn't look like much. So let's stretch it by 3 times in the vertical direction, and voila, now it looks great. Again, now we can easily see, here's the Hoosick River Valley, the valley over between Greylock and Taconic Range, schist at all the high points. Okay, and I also want to point out in this cross section, okay, how do we know exactly what shape the folds are 6 kilometers down? We don't. This is an extrapolation and an uninformed guess. But we're pretty, you know, based on the fact that they're all folded at the surface, we can infer that they're folded at depth. And based on where they poke out at the surface, we can infer something about the shapes of the folds at depth. So that's what we have here. It's very common, even usual, for during metamorphism, you're burying things deeply, you're squeezing them, you're moving them around, so they very often get folded and deformed and so on. Okay, the Taconics, Greylock Range, Hoosick Range, in case I forgot, which I didn't. So why are the marbles special? Why do they form valleys? Well, marble has a very special property compared to all the other common metamorphic rocks. It's very soluble in ordinary water, mildly acidic rainwater, say, or groundwater. And also it's a very soft rock. It's made of calcium and magnesium carbonates, which you can easily scratch with a knife, unlike, say, the schists and granites, which are much tougher than steel, mineral by mineral. Here's the gravestone in South Lund Cemetery in Williamstown of Elmina E. Eldridge, which I couldn't actually read her entire name. I had to go look it up on Gravefinder. It looked like she died in 1823, but it's actually 1825 according to Gravefinder. And then when you look at her epitaph, it's almost entirely dissolved away. So yeah, extremely soluble. This is a 200-year-old stone, and just rainwater over that time has probably removed a couple millimeters of the surface, almost wiping out the finest of the writing. So you can see if marble is exposed at the surface, its tendency for dissolution in our wet climate, and its softness in response to the scraping action of rocks and sand being dragged by rivers or glaciers, make it easily eroded compared to all the other rocks in our area. So it makes sense that once you start eroding the marble, it's going to erode down fast and end up being the floors of valleys. Another great example, going back to Natural Bridge State Park, thank you, Kristen Parker. Here's the bridge, and below it you see this steep chasm, and you can see the effects of simple dissolution by water dissolving along the cracks there. This great deep fissure was itself initially just a crack, and water percolating down and flowing through it slowly dissolved it away and eroded it away with, you know, rocks and gravel being carried along by these rushing streams. So you don't see chasms like this in the schist or anything else around here. It's due to the extremely vigorous erosion rate of marble in our area. Okay, so there we are again. Marbles in the valleys. Why? Because they're easily eroded. Schists remain high up on the ridges, getting left further and further behind as erosion continues. We're seeing the end result of erosion here. I'm going to restore what it may have looked like a few 100 million years ago by adding back the part of the map cross section that I blanked out. Ta-da! So there we go. As speculative as this is down here, this is even more speculative. The inference about rocks were there a few 100 million years ago. But here we see it. Think back to our tectonic map, the deep water sediments. Okay, remember our schists are now in purple here. The deep water sediments being shoved back up and over on top of the shallow water sediments, the marble, formerly limestone in blue. So here we see that, this great giant thrusting action. Huge sheets of these deep water sedimentary rocks being shoved up kilometers, tens of kilometers to what is now the west, being piled up on the shallow water sediments. But so what happens? Well, at this time, there was nothing but schist visible at the surface. Not particularly exciting geology, unless you're like a schist aficionado. But now imagine we start eroding down through that a few 100 million years ago, eroding very slowly through that tough resistant schist, going chomp, 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 chomp. Okay, at some point, that erosion surface intersects the marble at the tops of these folds. And when it hits the marble, it goes from chomp, 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 to chomp, 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 chomp. And so, you know, it may have been a level erosion surface to this point, but once it hits the marbles start really working their way down there. And so you end up with deep valleys, floored by marble, getting deeper all the time, and high peaks of schist surrounding them. Okay, and so you can see this, this geologic history, the sedimentation at the edge of a continent back 500 million years ago, followed by a huge cataclysm some tens of millions of years later that took all these, shoved them up into their present positions, and created those giant folds that gave us the template on which that differential erosion could work. And there we have it. That's basically the bedrock geologic story of how we got to where we are. Do I have more to say? Yeah, okay. So to finish up the bedrock part of our story here, I said we see these same general relationships throughout the Berkshires, north to south, and you can see it here. I've extended the map all the way down to Connecticut, and you can see, once again, the marble in blue going all the way down in valleys the whole way. When you get to South Berkshire County, it gets more complicated. The orange ends up having less schist and more quartzite and various other metamorphic rocks. There's a lot more granite, these red patches, but the general story is the same. The valleys are floored by marble, and the highlands are made of the other rocks. Like, for example, let's see, Mount Washington and Mount Everett here, for example. And I don't know the geography of South Berkshire to say much more than that. Okay, just an environmental note here for the environmental action team. The bedrock geology, it has a first order influence on the ecology of our plant systems here, and by inference, I suppose, on animal systems as well. Here's an example, pitch pines growing on quartzite bedrock, way at the crest of the ridge, just a little bit north of Pine Cobble on the Appalachian Trail, slightly into Vermont. And pitch pines are extraordinarily well adapted to thrive on these really thin, nutrient-poor soils that tend to develop on quartzite. Remember, quartzite is just pure SiO2. There's almost none of the normal nutrients that a plant would need. But pitch pines have evolved to do it, and they do it really well. And they're also very resistant to fire. So back in olden days, when natural wildfires would regularly sweep across the ridge, the pitch pines would live and thrive, and all their competitors would get burnt to ash. And so we have this pitch pine environment that's made possible by the generosity of the quartzite making this high ridge. And I know Hank Art, Professor Emeritus of Biology, is directing a project with the Williamstown Rural Lands Foundation at Sheep Hill, further south in Williamstown, where they're working to eliminate invasive plants to restore a native community of unusual plants that are specially suited to growing on calcic bedrock. And they really love to grow in the calcic soils that develop above marble. And so there's a ridge next to Sheep Hill that is marble and is historically supported lots of very interesting and unusual plant communities, but has been overwhelmed by farming and by the invasion of non-native species. And Hank's directing a project to try and restore that, so that very special, unusual ecosystem can come back to where it once was. All right, so that's, the first 500 million years went by in a flash. Those are the pink rocks in the diagram. Then a few hundred million, that was longer. I'm going to slow down things even more, but don't worry, it's not going to, most of the talk is done. How did events of the recent past further shape the landscape? Obviously, it didn't all end with the erosion of our 500 million year old rocks. And so what's the biggest recent event that had the most obvious effects? It is the last ice age, last of many ice ages, but the last ice age, I shouldn't say the last, the most recent ice age. Hopefully there will be more if we don't totally screw it up. Although, I don't know, do we want to be overrun by ice again? Here's the ice extending, covering North America all the way down into the Central Great Plains, almost all in New England, New York City, and here's the Berkshires, under probably a kilometer and a half of ice. We know that even Mount Greylock was covered, because when you go to the summit of Mount Greylock, the schist there has deep scratches and grooves, scratched by the rocks and pebbles that were dragged along at the base of the glacier that went right over the summit. So probably at least a kilometer and a half of ice filling the valleys at that point. So that's a lot of ice. So it reached its maximum extent about 25,000 years ago, depositing glacial debris to make things like Long Island and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard at the end. But as we know, because here we are in Williamstown, we're not covered in ice, the glacier retreated as the climate warmed. And eventually, some 14,000 years ago, we had a situation that looked something like this. A map kindly made by Herdman Cleland, a bit over 100 years ago, who studied a lot of the more recent deposits in our area. And some 14,000 years ago, by reconstructing from the available evidence, our northern Berkshires would have looked something like this. Here's the retreating ice front, almost but not quite gone from the Hoosick River Valley as the ice melts back to the north. But remember, okay, here's the Taconic Ridge, the Greylock Range, the Hoosick Range, and here are our present day valleys: Adams, North Adams, Williamstown, Pownell, North Pownell, Bennington. Remember, the Hoosick River flows north. Okay, so as glacial meltwater accumulates, okay, it's going to fill these valleys, and it has nowhere to go because the elevation gets higher and higher here. It would like to flow out on the natural topography to the north, but it's blocked by the front of the ice. And so instead, the meltwater backs up, and our valleys, including Williamstown, Pownell, North Adams, are submerged by a lake until the lake level eventually rises to the point some 1,100 feet, or actually more recent, a bit over 1,000 feet, and eventually spills over a bedrock pass down by what until recently was the Berkshire Mall. So the lake was there for quite a long time, and as lakes do, it collected sediment. And where it collects sediment most vigorously in this situation is at the ice front. Because remember, a glacier is transporting rocks, sand, gravel, everything it comes in contact with that's loose, it picks up and carries along, and then it eventually dumps it at the end of the glacier. Let's think about what will be going on at that ice front, where the ice front meets the lake. And we can look at a modern analog where something similar to that is going along at a much smaller scale today. And so let's go to John Bascom. Sorry, I tricked myself. This lake is known as Lake Bascom, named after John Bascom, a professor of geology at Williams College and later president of the University of Wisconsin. But I especially want to point out he had a very illustrious geological daughter, Florence Bascom, who had quite a career of her own. Real groundbreaker. She was only the second woman in the United States to earn a PhD in geology. The first woman to earn a PhD of any kind from Johns Hopkins University. She was the first woman hired by the US Geological Survey, and she did groundbreaking geologic research, basically understanding the evolution of the landscape in the Appalachians of Western Pennsylvania. Groundbreaking work. So Florence Bascom. And I should mention also the Geological Society of America recently instituted an award, the Florence Bascom Award for Geologic Mapping, to reward excellence in that particular field. Okay, so here's our sort of modern analog. Here's the Llewellyn Glacier in British Columbia. I guess I should have darkened this slide a little. Ice is bright. Yeah, so my colleagues here, Newt and Paolo, are sitting next to the Llewellyn Glacier, which is flowing from the right toward the left. And at the terminus of the glacier where it ends, you can see our valleys filled with lakes of meltwater fed by the continuous melting of the glacier. Llewellyn Glacier, like most glaciers in North America, or virtually all of them, is thinning rapidly and shrinking rapidly. And you can see only like 150 years ago, this foreground was covered in glacial ice, which its movement scraped clean all of this bedrock, smoothed it out. As the ice melted, it dumped a bunch of, whatever sand, gravels, mud, any other things it was carrying in a sort of jumbled heap on the ground. And that is the material we refer to as till, glacial till, the jumbled mass of random rocks and sand and whatever dumped by the ice as it melts. Not enough time for the vegetation to really grow other than a few pioneering flowers. So this is very rapid glacier loss. You can see the trim line here in the background in the side of the valley, that much in the last 150 years is how much the glacier is thinned. And it used to be way down the valleys, and the front has retreated as it melts back. But anyway, thinking about what happens down here at the front of the glacier, to think about our Lake Bascom analog. Here we are. Here's the front. You can see the water is all milky and muddy looking. Where is the sediment coming from? Well, the glacier Okay. The glacier is melting at the surface, but the water doesn't run down the surface of the glacier, at least not very far. Instead, it encounters some of these crevasses or other holes in the ice, works its way down through the ice to the bottom of the glacier, where it collects in huge amounts and goes rushing along the ground as rushing torrents, carrying sand and gravel and so on. In places where the glaciers are end on dry land, you can see these rushing torrents emerging from underneath the glacier and the whole landscape of sand and gravel being deposited by them. But here, this lake is impounded by a natural sediment dam at the end of the valley, and so the water collects. And so the rushing water, bearing its big load of sand and gravel, emerges from under the glacier, dumps its sand when it hits the lake. The mud wafts along and slowly settles to the bottom further away. And so in this particular configuration, we'd expect to find lots of sand and gravel being deposited in the lake right here, and mud further away from the front. In time, in a few hundred years, the glacier front will have retreated way back here. And what was once the place where sand and gravel were deposited will start to accumulate the mud, because that's now the quiet water. So what will we expect to find as a glacier retreats? We'd expect to find the smooth bedrock surface with maybe a little pile of glacial till on top of it. On top of that, coarse sand and gravel being dumped from underneath the glacier as the glacier retreats. And then on top of that, a big pile of fine silt and mud from when the glacier is retreated far away. And if we come back to Williamstown, we see something very much like that from Old Lake Bascom. Okay, here we are. Here's a cross section through the pile of sediments near the Route 7 bridge in Williamstown. Here's some boreholes that were made to look at the underlying sedimentary sequence. Thanks to David DeChair and the Massachusetts Department of Public Works for making the black and white portion of this diagram. And so we can see here on the bottom is marble bedrock in our case. There's a little tiny bit of till, this speckledy thing with triangles. On top of that is coarse sand and gravel that I've colored blue. On top of that is the fine-grained clay, silt, and sand, two varieties, one stippled, one dashed. And then at the very top is just modern river sediments from the Hoosick River. But this whole package here, as indicated by the red brackets, is sediment deposited in glacial Lake Bascom, and then the river sediment, a little thin veneer on top of it. So I'll mention I've colored the coarse sand and gravel blue because sand and gravel is very porous, and water collects in the pore spaces and it flows through the pore spaces very rapidly. And so it makes a great aquifer, a great reservoir of groundwater in these sands and gravels. And this actually, Route 7 bridge is just, I don't know, maybe half a mile. This way you get to the Williamstown Municipal Wells that taps that aquifer. Yeah.
I can't see the scale. Is that 150 feet?
Oh, yeah, this is meters. So here's 110 meters elevation above sea level, 185. So it's about 75 meters of sediment, some 70 meters of lake sediment. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, in other places where sediments were deposited from rivers flowing over the ground, they were deposited at the edge of the lake. And so here's some sand and gravel at a pit in Pownell, Vermont, Hart's Pit. And now imagine you had rivers, instead of coming out under the glacier, suppose they're coming down the valley walls. And instead of going into the lake, they're depositing sediment on or at the edge of the glacier itself, at the edge of the ice. What might you get? Features like this. Here we are, Hillside Cemetery in North Adams. These great mounds, the irregular topography, mounds and hollows. And this is exactly such a deposit. Still there. Imagine that the sand and gravel accumulates on the edge of the ice or actually on the ice itself. When the ice melts, that sand and gravel that accumulates in depressions is going to end up on the ground as a big heap or mound. And so these are what we refer to as canes, which are mounds of sediment deposited by streams in contact with glacier ice, either on it or banked against it. And when the ice melts, you get that topography. And here's another view. Again, that very characteristic cane topography. And of course, rocks were carried and dumped by the flowing ice itself. So we get, for example, a glacial erratic boulder. Erratic, why? Well, here's some boulders of quartzite. Thank you, Melanie. On on the crest of the Hoosick Range, 2,300 feet above sea level. They're resting on schist. How did quartzite boulders end up on the schist? Well, they had to be carried there by glaciers because no river or stream was going to carry that thing. So ice flowed over the top of the Hoosick Range. It carried everything big and small. Among the big things were these quartzite boulders, and when it melted, it dumped those right on the ridge. They're called erratic because they don't seem to belong there. They're kind of weird. Great boulders of quartzite sitting on an outcrop of schist with no quartzite to be seen for miles and miles. There's another example, thank you, John, with his hand on a boulder of the Stamford granite. Again, on the crest of the Hoosick Range, sitting on schist, miles from the nearest Stamford outcrop. So this boulder must have been picked up and carried miles by the glaciers, from up north in around Stamford, down south to the Hoosick Range. And then finally, my final slide here. Glacial erratics are a big deal in the Berkshires, so they're quite famous. Here's one, Balance Rock, in what's now Pittsfield State Forest in Lanesboro. There's another great one over in Savoy Mountain State Park. But here it is, Berkshire County Historical Society had nicely posted a picture here. And there it is, circa 1990s is what they label it. Now it's surrounded by trees, and I'm sure the graffiti is different, but the rock's still there and it's still balanced and will presumably be there for some time. And how does it come to be perched there? Well, it has to be carefully placed by a glacier. Probably a glacier that actually had other sediment piled around it to help it stay up until it finally ended up perched here. But you know, as the finer sand and mud and whatever that was around it is washed away over 14,000 years, we get this fantastic thing to look at. So that's about what I have to say. We could do like 4 hours on the glacial geology, but I'm not the person for that. You might want to consider inviting David DeChair, the professor emeritus at Williams, who has spent decades studying these features in our area. Okay, so that's about it. I want to say special thanks to the Berkshire Environmental Action Team for inviting me. Thanks to David DeChair, who shared glacial pictures and diagrams. And also thanks to all the people who post great rock photos on all trails. Keep it up, good work. Okay. Oh, sorry, thanks. And I'm just going to mention, I brought the geologic map of Massachusetts. I also have a geologic map of North Adams and Williamstown close up. And there's a bunch of rocks of our local rock formations there, if anyone wants to hang around afterward and look at them or talk about them. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I went a little over the, Chelsea said about half an hour, so I took liberties with the ambiguity of about.
No, that's great. So, okay. Does anyone have any questions? Go into Q&A and.
How deep do you have to go before these rocks that are variably wearing away or not wearing away start to get so hot? They're more and more fluid instead of hard rock.
Probably tens of kilometers.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, how far deep do you have to go before the rocks that are being metamorphosed start to become fluid? Is that a...
Fluid or at least soft.
Yeah, fluid or at least soft.
They're rippled.
Yeah.
They're tilted.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so those folds you see are largely, you know, sort of, to a large extent, brittle folds. You know, you'd see tiny little microfractures adding up to a great big fold. Sometimes they're a bit more ductile, you might say. They're capable of flowing. So you get down, you know, maybe tens of kilometers and they start to soften up from the heat, and then they might be able to flow more ductily. Some rocks do that more easily than others. Then when you get down very deep, like near the base of the crust, 40, 50 kilometers, you might actually get temperatures where in some parts of the globe, they might be hot enough to start melting. You start seeing pods of melt developing within the rocks, or at least you see the pods of melt when the erosion brings them back to the surface. You don't actually go down and see the. Yeah, so probably talking about tens of kilometers before things start to get, you know, softened. And, you know, they can soften to the point of ductility in the solid state. Imagine, you know, hammering a red hot horseshoe. It's solid, but it's hot enough that you can bend it and shape it. And then eventually, if you heat the horseshoe up enough, it melts. So both of those things can happen, but you know, tens of kilometers are probably what we're usually talking about in most cross sections through the Earth's surface. Yeah.
When I was a little kid, I used to worry about volcanoes erupting.
Uh-huh.
Can I relax now?
Oh yeah, you can relax. I mean, 460 million years ago, you should have been very, very worried. That was right when the tectonic volcanic arc was right here, looming over over the Berkshires. I should say, Paul Carabinus here at Williams College has studied the tectonics of New England in great detail for decades, and he has determined through careful study and dating of the rocks that the volcanic arc that crashed into North America during Devonian orogeny is probably the same as the granites and so on you see exposed in the potholes in the river in Shelburne Falls. That seems to be the correct age of igneous rock and the right type of igneous rock to have been the core of this volcanic arc that crashed into North America. The timing, the age of those igneous rocks matches pretty well. They're just a little bit older than the metamorphism that happened when those crashed into North America. So around here, yeah, in New England, the last volcanism was 70 million years ago. A weird little pulse of volcanism that's hard to explain in the White Mountains in Vermont, in New Hampshire, and so on. But yeah, for next, I'd say, don't worry about it tonight, and I think we're all good and safe. Yeah, yeah. There's no sign of anything developing either.
I have a question, just putting things in perspective, because we had the Precambrian and the tectonic orogeny. Like, I understand Pangea, so where did Pangea fall? Like, was it before all this, in the middle, after?
Oh, let's repeat the question. Okay, yeah, sorry. So where does Pangea fit into this sequence of time? So Pangea are, yeah, sorry, I'm doing it the least efficient way, but it's the only way I know. Okay, yeah, so Pangea, when basically all the continents of the globe, all the really big ones at least, were combined into one huge supercontinent. Pangea came into existence about 300 million years ago, 250, 300. Yeah, and hung around for 100 million years before it started to break up again. So Pangea would have formed after this, but you might also think of this as being, one of the early steps in the formation of Pangea. It didn't all happen at once. Bits crashed together here and there until suddenly there it was, supercontinent. So here is one little element of our coming supercontinent going blip, smashes on here, and now North America is a little better. And more things come in, and there were like 3 major mountain building collisions in the Appalachians during a period from about 460 to 200 and I don't know the other end of it, 200 and something million years. Over the course of 100 and something million years, there were sort of 3 big events where things crashed into North America and grew it. And more recently, things crashed onto the West Coast. And so most of far western North America was added after this happened. But the point being that this is just one of our early stages of the building of Pangea, and eventually some 250 million years ago, Pangea was pretty much finished when Africa and Eurasia smashed into North and South America, and that was it. Then it hung around a while before it started breaking up again. So those are very rough dates.
So I had no idea that the Berkshires were on the coast at one point, like on this slide.
Oh, yeah.
So are there like ocean fossils, like sea creatures that are deep in the Berkshires before all these islands piled on top of it, or you know anything about fossils?
Yeah. So are there any fossils that's showing the Berkshires were on the coast at that time? Well, not in the Berkshires. In the Berkshires, there's a few tiny remnants that people have found. But for the most part, they were all destroyed by that cataclysmic metamorphism and recrystallization. But you still see them. You just go a little west in New York, and they're there in tremendous abundance. You can see, the Cambrian fossils, the Ordovician fossils, great beautiful limestone sequences illustrating these. So we can think of some of the Cambrian and Ordovician limestones in New York as being more or less the equivalent of what we had here, except not metamorphosed. They were too far from the mountain front. there are still beautiful things full of beautiful fossils.
I have a Zoom question.
Mhm.
What kind of rock is balance rock? Is it schist? Is it quartzite?
I don't even know. I'm ashamed to say I haven't even been to Balance Rock in Pittsfield. I've been to see the one in Savoy Mountain, but I didn't know about the one in Pittsfield until I was looking for the one in Savoy Mountain to get a picture, and there was one in Pittsfield, and I said, wow. And it turns out my son knows all about it. He goes there all the time. What kind of rock is Balance Rock in Pittsfield State Forest? So looking at it, okay, this isn't the highest quality diagnostic picture, but oh, yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, that could be schistose, but then the massive part here, well, I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's not marble anyway. But beyond that, I can't really say. Yeah.
Some of those original carved words are still in there.
Yeah.
Underneath the spray paint, but there's teams that have been getting rid of the spray paint. And
Oh,
so
great.
it's looking as natural as it ever has.
Oh, okay.
So go visit it.
So what kind of rock is it?
I think it's just.
Schist? Okay. Yeah, so this is telling us schist. This part is faking it. Okay, schist. Yes, schist. I know that. Thank you, Joe.
Is it possible to predict what the Berkshires will look like in the next few million years?
Well, I don't know. I'd say probably the mountains and ridges will continue to erode down very, very slowly. The question is, are the valleys going to fill up with sediment from that? Or, as the mountains erode, is the sediment going to accumulate in the valleys, in which case the valleys move up as the mountains move down and the topography becomes less? Or could something happen that causes this valley sediment to wash away? And usually that would happen if you uplift the entire region due to some tectonic event. Then as you lift it up, where the valleys suddenly become high altitude and the sediment that collected in them might wash away. But I think there's some evidence of ongoing gentle uplift on a tectonic scale in the northeastern US. You got weird earthquakes in the Adirondacks and occasional earthquake in Washington, DC some years ago that some people have speculated are due to a very broad, gentle, subtle regional uplift for reasons unknown, probably having to do with something deep in the mantle. But so if that happens, maybe the valleys will start to empty. But if I had to bet, I would say the valleys are probably going to fill with more sediment and the mountains are going to erode down. And so it'll be a shorter hike from, say, town to the top of Mount Grayling. But do you have a suggestion, Rónadh?
Base level, so as sea level rises, so you've got the elevation difference between the source area and the ultimate sink, which is the ocean. So if sea level is rising, you're reducing the overall slope. So that's sort of a base level rise. So there'd be a net less energy to transport sediment, which would support this idea that we're more likely to fill the valleys. If sea level continues to rise and the mountains start going up again.
Yeah, there's no sign of anything truly dramatic, no sign of an impending mountain building or anything like that.
It sounds like the Berkshires have grown and eroded and grown and eroded through the eons. How tall were the Berkshires before the current erosion started, say compared to other mountain ranges that we know of today?
Okay, yeah, so the question was, Berkshires have undergone uplift and erosion possibly multiple times. How tall were they at their tallest? Well, I think the one really huge mountain building event in the Berkshires is the one here. The following mountain building events happened mainly further to the east, and we see some of their effects in the Berkshires, but the Berkshires were probably not lifted up again to the towering heights they achieved in the first go-around. So some of the guesses from tectonic reconstructions are maybe in the 10,000, 20,000 feet high, but it's really extremely speculative because it's hard to know. But high mountains, sort of Rocky Mountain scale mountains, maybe not quite Himalayan scale, although when we look further east in central Massachusetts, the deep exposed rocks that we see there seem to indicate that they formed at extremely high pressure, as though the mountains in the next big mountain building event about 350 million years ago, the so-called Acadian mountain building event. That may have made Himalayan scale mountains, because the rocks deep in the crust there are really, really deep. And we see them now because everything's eroded away. But so we probably had, Rocky Mountain scale mountains here in the Berkshires, and maybe Himalayan scale mountains over in central Massachusetts. And then the final big tectonic collision in North America to form Pangaea happened mainly further to the south in the central and southern Appalachians. So I don't really know much about that. It's a long way away. So.
I actually had a question real quick.
Yeah.
So I once had someone tell me that there isn't true clay. I don't know if that's the exact phrase they used in New England because of the glaciers. Can you speak on that at all?
Well, I don't know. So there's definitely, so clay has a couple of different technical meanings. Clay can refer to types of minerals that have an atomic structure, the aluminums and silicons bound together in a certain way. So those are clay minerals, and like kaolinite, the chalky white clay, is a clay mineral, and it's also a clay in the sense of sedimentary geologists like to define clay as an exceedingly fine microscopic grain, smaller than, say, a silt particle. So often, clay-sized particles will actually be clay minerals. Sometimes they'll just be exceedingly tiny fragments of other minerals. But so there's definitely clay-sized sediment in the Berkshires, and also clay minerals in the Berkshires. And so the bottom, the fine sediments of Lake Bascom in places have lenses of pretty decent clay that sometimes you see eroding out of stream banks today, and you pick it up and you mush it and it's pasty and it feels like clay. My wife has tried making pots out of it, and it's not the greatest potter's clay, but it produces some interesting features.
You can make great, there are parts of it that people have harvested for pottery, and it has been dug out for brickmaking near North Annex.
Yeah.
So there are, it's mostly in Lake Bascom.
We got one more question.
Okay.
Where did all that 10K to 20K feet high mountain material go?
Where did all that 10K to 20K mountain material go? Well, it was eroded off to the sides. And so a huge amount of it you see piled up in New York and Pennsylvania and all the way out to Ohio. Imagine, 10 or, let's see. I'll tell you. Yeah, imagine all that stuff eroding down, rivers carry it out, it goes out in great big sedimentary fans. And so all the way from, the maritime provinces in Canada down to Georgia, where it gets buried under newer sediment, you see these great, huge, thick fans of thousands of feet thick of sediment shed from the old Appalachian mountains. Of course, a lot of it was shed off the other side, but we don't see it in the Atlantic Ocean because back then, Pangaea was in existence, the bits and parts of Pangaea had grown enough that the sediment shed off of the eastern side of the mountains mostly accumulated in land masses that eventually split apart and ended up over in northern Europe. Now we can see sediments that are kind of almost identical to the sediments in New York and Pennsylvania you now see in Scotland and the United Kingdom and so on. You were going to the Catskills.
The Catskill Mountains.
Okay.
Are giant piles of the sediment that came off those mountain ranges. They were deposited in rivers and deltas and coastal plains. And then when they got turned into rock, they were much more resistant than the mountain material that had sourced them. So the mountain material got preferentially eroded away, and that's why the Catskills are mountain forming, but they are actually made of sediment that shed off these mountains that weren't.
Yeah. So comparing the geology of Massachusetts and New York is really fun, because Massachusetts is where the mountains grew, and New York is where all the debris collected. But it's really fun. Okay, is that it? Oh, okay. Yes.
Do you have terraces here?
Like river terraces? We have some. They're kind of subtle. But you see breaks in slope on the valley walls, and David DeChair tells me that some of those are old river and lake terraces. But I don't really have a good enough eye for that sort of thing. But so sometimes the subtle breaks in slope on hillsides might be old terraces, but they don't extend up very far. I think Lake Bascom itself only ever achieved a depth of 100 feet or something, and once you get high up on the mountainsides, you see, you know, a thin pile of till left behind by the glaciers, but essentially nothing of river or lake terraces. So river and lake terraces are maybe breaks and slope down low. It's quite possible that there are river and lake terraces that I don't know about, but I'm not a specialist in that. We might think of like the sand pit that I showed a picture of in Pownell was sort of a terrace. You imagine where rivers were entering the lake and dumping all the sediment. It's not really a terrace, it's more of a fan of sand, a delta. Yeah, I don't know. And if we get down into the valleys, I imagine there might be places where, you know, the river is cut down and old river terraces are left standing higher. But if they're there, I wouldn't be surprised if they're there, but I don't know of them and I don't know where to find them. Sorry.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.